Thank you so much for joining us today. Uh, We, uh, Excuse me. Again, my name is David Sorrell. I'm the board member with Seamless Bay Area, a grassroots organization that advocates for more integrated and rider-friendly regional transit system. We are proud to co-host today's event with Friends of Caltrain. We felt that it was necessary to convene this conversation to talk about the recent events involving Caltrain, in which were very confusing and frustrating for many Bay Area residents and commuters, and also to discuss what's next for Caltrain service and how people can stay involved. We're fortunate to have two of the Bay Area's preeminent transportation experts with us today. Adina Levin of Friends of Caltrain and Rachel Swan, transportation reporter at the San Francisco Chronicle. They will take us behind the scenes and explain what really happened with the Caltrain ballot measure this past summer. But first, I want to hand it over to Friends of Caltrain member Yoriko Kishimoto to say a few words, and then we will turn to Adina and Rachel. Yoriko, please take it away.
Yes, good afternoon. My name is Yoriko Kishimoto, and I'm the former mayor of Palo Alto. And I am here as the co-founder and board chair of the Friends of Caltrain. So Friends of Caltrain is a nonprofit grassroots advocacy organization that supports stable funding and the successful modernization of Caltrain as part of an integrated regional transit network, accessible to all. Thanks to Adina Levin's amazing work, we have over 7,000 supporters in the San Francisco Peninsula corridor between San Francisco and San Jose. So we are very excited to be here with you today to talk about the goings-on with Caltrain this summer, about the behind-the-scenes dynamic to the turning points that ultimately kept the Caltrain ballot measure moving forward. So we think that there's a number of important lessons that we can take away from this showdown that have implications for the future of transit service, for the transit advocacy and transit leadership in the Bay Area. So a few logistical notes before we begin. Adina and Rachel will engage in conversation for 25 or 30 minutes, after which they'll answer your questions. So we invite everyone on the call to send in questions through the Q&A function at any time, or you could wait and ask to present your question live as well. So I'm very proud to introduce Adina Levin and Rachel Swan. Adina Levin is Executive Director of Friends of Caltrain. She's also co-founder and advocacy director for Seamless Bay Area and one of the Bay Area's most knowledgeable transportation and transit experts. And Rachel Swan covers transportation for the San Francisco Chronicle. So her reporting on Caltrain was really critical in bringing the whole Bay Area's attention to these important challenges facing such a essential part of the Bay Area transit network. Rachel has worked at the Chronicle since 2015 and has also reported on politics in Oakland and San Francisco. Previous to that, she held staff positions at the San Francisco Weekly and East Bay Express. So welcome, Adina and Rachel.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Can everybody hear me? Great.
Yes.
So I can, I guess I'll start off. One thing that's been interesting through this whole saga, we know that the ballot measure we're looking at for November, at one point when it was polled in June, it had, it has to reach this steep threshold of 2/3 vote in 3 counties. But at one point in June, it looked like it was going to be fairly successful. And I recall reading from some polling that Caltrain did that support was kind of narrowly at 2/3, and then it actually reached 70% when people were really told of the regional benefits of the rail service. So I'm really curious, Adina, what have you heard? How are you feeling right now as far as, we're in this pandemic, presidential election, sales taxes are not always popular. There are possibly many of them on the ballot. I mean, what have you heard as far as this measure's chances?
Mm-hmm. First of all, I'm feeling really good. Friends of Caltrain is working on the grassroots campaign arm of the measure. And this is where people, like us, those of us on this webinar, where the things that we do with the phone banking and text banking and reaching out to our friends and neighbors, what we do is not going to be able to do the same thing that like mass media advertising can do and radio ads and TV ads, but what we do is going to be the margin of victory. And we're engaged with other nonprofits and grassroots groups that are really excited about doing it. And there is the business community is doing fundraising to have a well-funded campaign. What you said about the polling coming out in late June, one of the reasons why this whole story seemed to kind of spring on us from nowhere at the end of June and the beginning of July is that with the pandemic, even though the ballot measure was kind of creeping along, almost nobody, including me, thought that the polling was going to be good. Like most people thought it was going to poll at 45% and it was going to be dead and we would all be like worried about how to keep Caltrain running. But the polling did come back really good with what you said, which it goes up to 70% with a well-funded and active campaign. And so on the one hand, I think that the kerfuffle that we're all here to hear a little bit more about caused things to happen maybe a few weeks later than they might have, but it also really broadcast to a broad audience. And the public sentiment really clearly was, what on earth is anybody thinking to keep this from going on the ballot? Because we really need Caltrain as part of our regional transit system to keep running. So I think that was in some way helpful that many more people know about this and how important it is.
Now, with the kerfuffle, we had this really like almost like a monstrosity of approvals that this measure had to get through. 4 transit boards, 3 boards of supervisors. I guess I just wanted to start even looking at the big picture. What is the sheer approval process? What's wrong here? Is this normal? What does this illustrate about? Just can a small group of people derail something that's important to the many? Or what are your takeaways? Just broadly as far as the approval process to even get this thing on the ballot.
Yeah, well, the approval process is a symptom of something that is and has been a fundamental challenge with Caltrain going back to the very beginning. So going back to in the 80s, Southern Pacific ran it. Southern Pacific kind of ran out of money. The state took it over, and then the state didn't want it anymore. And San Mateo County bought the right of way, very far-sighted decision, and partnered with the San Francisco and Santa Clara County to take this over and created a joint powers authority to run Caltrain. And because Samtrans had put the money up, they were managing it. But from the beginning, it was this kind of unstable partnership with those 3 partners. And the way that worked from the beginning is Caltrain's funding has come mostly from fares, mostly from riders. And then the public funding came from those 3 partners, and every year, each of the partners decided whether they were going to pay their bill. And like this is a Zoom meeting. When I tell this story in person, and the laughter and expressions of incredulity when you say whether, and what has been happening ever since the 90s is every few years, one of the agencies is having a financial challenge, or maybe one of them is trying to negotiate for something or other, and the budget has gotten hung up. And then what has happened multiple times repeatedly is the threat of service cuts, the threat of fare increases, the threat of maintenance reductions, and you have each of the agencies negotiating amongst each other and kind of barely keeping the thing running smoothly. And so the way that this ballot measure, so the goal of the ballot measure is to provide stable funding for Caltrain, which is as needed as never had. And yet the way it needs to get on the ballot also has this property where each and every of its partners needs to agree, and if they don't, something dire can possibly happen. So this instability baked into Caltrain's governance has been kind of the original sin of the matter.
Now, we had a series of compromises. I mean, the original discontent was some people were upset with various peculiarities with the governance, I guess you could call it governance structure of Caltrain, or, you know, who gets to pick the CEO. Are we, with the compromise that was eventually settled on, are we out of the woods with that, or is this whole argument over leadership going to come back again in a few years?
So it is going to come back, and there's some really good opportunities for it to be coming back in a way that could have really great outcomes. And, you know, or it could come back and cause big problems. And to explain that, I'm going to do a little bitty governance explainer, and then talk about the things that could go badly and go well, including the thing that it's the mission of Seamless Bay Area to make go well that you can all help with. So there's several different layers of this governance word, which what the heck does that mean? Part of this is who manages Caltrain, and right now it's Samtrans managing Caltrain. And you might wind up asking some questions that elucidate a little bit more about that, but because as part of a deal to rescue Caltrain from one of these financial crises back in 2008, Samtrans has the ability to manage Caltrain for as long as it wishes. And that deal, which was done in 2008, which Aaron Peskin signed, by the way, is still in place. And you know, there's some tension about that. And then above the managing agency, though, the staff, the managing agency can't do what they want. They are directed by a board. And the Caltrain board, the Caltrain Joint Powers Authority, has 9 members, 3 from each county. And almost all decisions they have made, including the budget decisions over time, have been unanimous. So they usually agree. When they don't agree, bad things happen. But then above that, if you think about what it takes to have Caltrain be a really good for people, for transit riders, it doesn't stand alone. You need to have local transit connecting to Caltrain feeder service. You need to have Caltrain connecting to BART and ACE and Capital Corridor. It needs to be integrated as part of a regional network. And in order to do that, Caltrain can't solve that on its own. That takes governance work at a higher level. And if you ask at a regional level, well, who is in charge of having Caltrain be well connected in terms of fares and schedules and customer experience to the rest of the network? The answer, unfortunately, is nobody. So this is one of these yikes moments, and so so part of the opportunity is to have Caltrain upgrade its governance on the good side if things go well, in order to be more stable, to avoid these perennial tugs of war, and also to have governance progress be done at a regional level, so you have Caltrain woven in to a regional system. And those things could be really good. I co-founded Friends of Caltrain with that mission that Yuriko mentioned, to be have stable funding. Stable is important. Successful modernization as part of that integrated regional system. And I co-founded Seamless Bay Area to work on bringing about that integrated regional system. So what could happen? So what that board agreement was to work through 2021 on a governance solution. And on the bad side, on the downside, it could turn into this war of all against all, with each entity wanting the most local control. And the Bay Area's big problem, the reason why we can't solve many of our big problems, is we try to solve our big regional problems with maximal local control, and that doesn't work. So if that perspective wins out, you know, we will not get nice things. But if we wind up with a solution where we take the goals of the Caltrain business plan, a vision that was adopted last fall, to make improvements to increase ridership by 3 to 4 times and have much better regional connections and a service that can be more equitably accessed by people at a variety of income levels, if those decisions are made in order to reach the goals, including to reach the goals of the regional integration, that could be really great. And that's something that everybody who's here will have opportunities, and we're going to need to keep an eye on it. So just because we all needed to keep an eye on it from the media and advocacy perspective, to keep that local control perspective from destroying things, we're going to need to keep an eye on it in order to have things go towards stability and seamlessness rather than towards internecine warfare.
So I'm just, you know, one thing that I kept seeing tweeted during this whole saga, and I don't know if this was just like getting into the realm of fantasy, but, you know, this is an argument that we hear a lot about, is like, hey, the Bay Area just has too many transit agencies. They don't play well together. This is an illustration. This is the quintessential illustration of that. You know, why don't we just like tear the whole thing down and you know, and create something that's more regional in nature, that's just one. I mean, how hard would that be?
Yes. So I'm going to give a plug for another event that is coming up on September 10th. And one of my Seamless colleagues is going to look this up, because Seamless Bay Area is doing this in partnership with Spur. And we are doing a panel with some research that we did along with a think tank organization called Transportation Choices, looking at other regions around the world that have successfully moved toward a more integrated system. And as a result of doing that, they increase their transit ridership, improve their equity. It is certainly possible to do that. And there's going to be some really good food for thought at that event about how it is possible. I'll just give you a really quick preview of some of the key points. And in order to bring this about, remember when I said there's absolutely nobody who's in charge of having integrated fares or integrated schedules? In order to do this, there needs to be some entity that is in charge. But does it need to be done by merging all of the agencies together? The short answer is no. There's several different ways of bringing it about. There's several ways of structuring it. You can come to the thing in the 10th and learn about the different ways that it can be done. But there does need to be somebody that's in charge of making that coordination and integration happen. Come on the 10th and learn more.
So believe it or not, one thing that I heard at various points when I was reporting on the Caltrain saga was people saying, well, I mean, and this is complicated by the fact that it was all happening during COVID. Caltrain had lost 90, possibly even 95, 95% of its ridership. So ridership was very low. It was losing, it normally has a very heavy high fare box recovery rate. So it was losing a lot of revenue and fares, which made the situation so much more dire. And people were saying to me, hey, why have Caltrain at all during this period? Why not just use buses? Why not just, yeah, you're really great expression. But what's the eye roll? Like, why can't we just use buses to replace the train until it's electrified?
Okay, so I'll talk about that with a couple little pieces. So first of all, SFMTA, when the pandemic hit and they didn't have enough operators, shut down the Muni light rail, and they're still having problems restoring it. But there are street routes that run parallel to those light rail vehicles, and it's also, the same people who can run light rail can also run the buses. So they were able to provide service even though that particular route underground wasn't running. With Caltrain, if you think about it, and you have a bus coming down 101 and you wanted where does the bus stop? There are no bus stops on 101. So you would need to replace Caltrain, which serves, many different stations with a whole bunch of point-to-point buses from San Francisco to San Mateo and San Francisco to Redwood City and San Francisco to Mountain View. Like, how on earth would that work? It wouldn't be very practical, to get the route on the highway. And then if you tried to have buses on El Camino Real, it takes about 3 hours to get from San Francisco to San Jose on a local bus. And, wouldn't it be great to have dedicated lane BRT on El Camino? And are we going to agree to do that in the next few weeks in order to be able to have express service? That's a world I would love to live in, but not work. So it's not really as practical as it sounds.
Another thing that we had so much political intrigue during the whole Caltrain, how do I say it, fiasco, the negotiations, So on the one hand, there were a lot of what I would call kind of arcane arguments over, various, everyone had their pet issue about governance control, but there were also kind of these larger arguments about, well, isn't Caltrain's ridership upper income, or should we do a sales tax because sales taxes are regressive? So we were hearing these kind of big ideological arguments mixed in with these super arcane political scuffling. But as far as the big stuff, should we be doing sales taxes to support Caltrain, and do certain income brackets deserve public transit more than others? How was this making you? What was your reaction to all of these things as you were hearing them?
Yeah, so I think those questions about equity and sales taxes are really good ones. And I think having them be raised is really important to take head on. And something that is extremely important that the Caltrain board is about to do this coming Thursday, tomorrow morning at the meeting starting at about 9 in the morning, is they are about to approve an unprecedented set of equity and connectivity policies with the goal of using funding from the measure to make Caltrain much more accessible. And this is something that with Friends of Caltrain, I have been working on as a campaign for over 5 years to start to do the research because when I started working on this, there used to be this stereotype that different people ride buses and trains because rich people, well-off people like riding trains, low-income people riding buses, and there's no reason to make it different because that's just what people want. And so we did some research and really started to show the structural disparities and the policies that caused that. And then Caltrain as an agency took that on and did an equity study, came up with a set of recommendations to improve matters that the board is about to approve tomorrow. So that this ballot measure, if it passes, will make Caltrain much more accessible to a much wider variety of people. So I think that's the answer to that question, which is that if you want to have a system that's accessible to all, then we should fund this and the policies that enable it. And shutting down Caltrain is not the route to making Caltrain accessible. Running it according to these policies is. At Friends of Caltrain, we do agree. We are not thrilled about the sales tax. We've been working as the region was thinking about doing a large regional measure, which is going to come back in a number of years probably. We were working on potentially having some more progressive revenue measures. But this right now, this 1/8 cent sales tax is what is on the table. SB 797, the bill that authorizes the tax, was passed in 2017. And if there was something in the legislature now, we would be arguing for a different funding source, but this is what's available. So, if the choice is doing this, keeping Caltrain running, maintaining this important link in our regional transit network, making it accessible to many more people, that is a reasonable choice to make. And it's a good question to ask. And this is not going to be our last transportation funding. So looking to the future at more progressive funding is something that we are going to be working on, but we need to keep Caltrain running now. And I'll just stop there in terms of addressing this question.
And I guess one thing I definitely wanted to touch on was, so you're someone who chose your home because you wanted to be, we've talked about this a lot, you wanted to be close to a Caltrain station, right? Like you specifically wanted to take mass transit, and you're someone who has to get everywhere around the Bay Area, and I know I heard from a lot of, when I was reporting on Caltrain, I know I heard from a lot of people, or people tweeted at me, I chose, and I chose my home to be close to BART, so a lot of people do choose where they live because they want to be close to mass transit. So, I mean, if Caltrain were to drastically cut service or shut down, I mean, let's talk about what kind of future that looks like in terms of what happens to the 101. Are there a lot of consequences that people wouldn't necessarily predict right now, but that could happen?
Yes. So I think, in starting with the individual stories, I had the same experience in, social media, people talking about if Caltrain wasn't running, they would need to get a different job. They wouldn't be able to live where they live. People that have disabilities and can't drive, people that wouldn't be able to see their children. It would really be an awful lot of disruption and personal suffering for people and a region that really depends on Caltrain running. The other thing is that, before the pandemic, Caltrain kept 4 lanes of cars off the highway. And so as the pandemic lifts, which it is going to do, there is no room to fit all those cars. And even if there is some more, work from home and a less peaky commute, there's still no way to fit all those cars, and it would be really very hellish. And so making sure that this piece of our public transportation system runs is really essential to have our overall transportation system work. And then lastly, the thing that a lot of people are concerned about in our area is housing. And, we do have a housing crisis and a housing shortage. that is a persistent problem. And, a lot of our region's ways of addressing the housing has been building the housing near the transit. So if you can think about if Caltrain wasn't running and was shut down for an undefined period of time, what would that do to needing to accommodate more people near transit, as opposed to having sprawl and pollution and greenhouse gas emissions. So there's a lot of reasons why Caltrain is really important from a traffic and environmental and housing perspective, which is why a lot of people are motivated to keeping Caltrain running and supporting Measure RR.
And maybe just like on a basic level, we should talk about like why this tax is important and what it does, just so people are clear. So, I mean, we know that Caltrain set out this like grand vision master plan last year. It wants to, I believe, increase ridership by about triple ridership. It's electrification is fully funded, so we're going to have like more trains, longer trains, the possibility of more frequent service, but also, as you mentioned, we had this system for like a very long time where each individual, I guess, county was, had its allotment that it was supposed to pay each year, and that was like a very unstable source. So can you just talk about like why this tax is important and why it creates more stability and the importance of like meeting those service goals?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the main thing that this does is it provides funding for Caltrain service, and it takes off the books of VTA and SFMTA and Samtrans the annual need to pay to run Caltrain. So it eliminates the bit where each partner might not be able to pay their bill that has caused so many problems over the years. And also, speaking of equity, it leaves the money in the pockets of VTA to run the buses and SFMTA to run the buses, and relieves some of the deep pain that the pandemic is causing for the entire public transportation system. And when electrification is complete in a few years, that will provide the funding to provide that more frequent service, and not just more frequent service at peak hour, but one of the key transformational elements of that business plan that will help to increase that ridership is more service throughout the day. So, in Caltrain had been conceived of as commuter rail, that it runs most of the service at peak period, but not like if you want to go to dinner and come home, the train is once an hour in the evening. So it really limits the kinds of things that you can use the service for. And this is also an equity issue, because people that don't have white collar jobs are much more likely to be working or traveling at other periods of time. So it would pay for the service that's more frequent throughout the day. And those are things that will help to make Caltrain better for people, help people live with fewer cars, and help increase the ridership.
When the three counties discussed this this tax and like this goal that seems to have very, very wide appeal of beefing up Caltrain's service, we found out that San Francisco and Santa Clara counties had grievances about Caltrain. They felt like Caltrain was controlled by Samtrans. At one point there was this theory that there was mixing of the funding between the buses and the trains, and they wanted to be able to make they wanted more decision-making power. Can you separate for us the myths from the facts, and have we fixed all this?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think a good source for this is some work that Caltrain did on governance in its own business plan, and it had a report on that. They hired somebody who ran Metro North for many years, who's really experienced, and what he concluded was that Caltrain was the highest performing service of its class in terms of the amount of efficiency and the amount of service that it provides for the amount of money. So if there's any hypothesis that was floating around that like Samtrans was stealing money, if they were stealing money, they were still leaving enough to make it the most efficient service of its class in the United States. So that really didn't seem particularly plausible. And the fact that the idea that San Mateo County is making all of the decisions, you know, the board has 3 people from San Francisco, 3 people from San Mateo, 2 people from Santa Clara counties, and almost all the time they make unanimous decisions. So that's not very plausible either. That does not make very much sense. However, the other thing this report concluded was that the status quo, which has managed Caltrain, you know, pretty well since the 90s, is not an option going forward in order to increase the service by the level that Caltrain is contemplating, running a more complicated interlinked service, taking on really large capital projects. There's going to need to be some changes and beefing up Caltrain. And also, the bits about running a more integrated service is something that will require some changes too. So change is needed, and we agree with the people who say that change is needed. One of the big moments of drama happened on the Caltrain board meeting on July 9th, when some of the San Mateo County board members said, hey, I don't think that change is needed for 10 to 20 years. And that was the point when the leaders in San Francisco and the leaders in Santa Clara County said, oh my goodness, these people are never going to agree to change. We need to try to force change in the most dramatic way possible. And, you know, that was what, you know, triggered a lot of that drama. But, you know, change is needed, but trying to force a change that would have blown up the ballot measure was, you know, basically too risky. And what they agreed on was something that would move forward change, but let the ballot measure go forward.
Let's move to some questions. We have a brimming Q&A. Okay, so we have
many.
That's you. Okay.
We have no, but Rachel would love your help here. I think the one that I was hoping Adina could go back to is a question from anonymous attendee about equity. And do you think renters and low-income people have a weaker voice in transportation determination than property and business owners, and those who may not use Caltrain and transit as much? And then on top of that, do you think that it hurts the perception of Caltrain that it's a tech train? So I'm wondering if you can speak to those angles.
Yeah. Okay. So in terms of the power of transit riders and the voice of people who are renters and lower income, there's been a coalition of groups that have been working on the equity policies that Caltrain is about to adopt. So, you know, that probably was true like 5 or 6 years ago, but there's been a lot of advocacy and organizing, first of all, to identify that, you know, Caltrain's ridership has been disproportionately whiter and wealthier, but that needs to change. It can change. And not only that, we have many models around the world of regions that manage their rail service in a way that is more integrated and equitable, and, you know, wind up with higher ridership and greater diversity. And also the voices of transit riders, you know, turning around the risky situation over the summer was really quite powerful. If it was only a few institutions, like it wasn't the institutions that rescued this thing from going off the rails. It was transit riders. It was the people who've been doing the advocacy. And, you know, a few people who were paying close attention and getting the word out to transit advocates, transit riders, people who cared, and the people who cared paying attention and calling their supervisors in San Francisco and calling their supervisors in Santa Clara County and making dozens of public comments and sending thousands of letters. that really made the difference in, having these disputes let the thing die. And I want to add one more thing before it's going to the next question, which is there has been transit rider input, and where we've been challenged is in some of our leadership. And board member Cheryl Brinkman on the SFMTA board said something really powerful when that board turned down a version of the ballot measure that would have been really difficult to pass. And she said, what I hear from the leadership is people talking about agencies fighting with agencies and not talking about the rider, not lifting up the needs of riders, not lifting up the needs of people, including people who can't afford to use Caltrain today. That's who our leadership needs to be focusing on. And, we need more of that kind of leadership.
Thank you, Adina. And Rachel, you should feel free to jump in and add a color to this from your reporting.
Sure. Yeah, I yield to Adina for now.
That's fine. That's fine. There's several questions in the Q&A right now about the politics, like what the heck was Supervisor Peskin thinking in holding up Caltrain's ballot measure? What's Peskin's beef with Caltrain? Adina, do you want to elaborate any more about the politics and maybe the personalities that were driving this past summer?
Sure. So, I mean, in terms of the politics, and because San Francisco almost spiked the measure on July 9th, a lot of the attention has, glommed onto San Francisco. And, however, there were leaders in Santa Clara County, including Supervisor Cindy Chavez and San Jose Mayor Sam Liccardo, who were also, I think there's a legitimate desire to mature Caltrain governance and have it be able to do what it needs to do in the business plan and not allow some of the goals of leaders in San Mateo County to preserve the status quo. They really wanted to shake up that status quo, and they were willing to do some brinksmanship to do the status quo. And I think that is a main theme here. But a challenge with the brinksmanship is, people who were willing to risk destroying something or risk causing severe damage to something that they would have had a really great difficulty in putting the pieces back together. So it is a desire for good and for ill to have more control over the system as part of its governance, and a willing to do really high stakes negotiation in a way that could cause things to go really badly for people who depend on transit to live.
I guess I could add to some of that, although I did personally find some of the politics of this rather mystifying, as I often do. It did seem like there was some interpersonal beef, and I guess some of our leaders felt perfectly okay, letting something that benefits the many collapse so that they could get something small, as so often happens with local control. I do know that, so as far as the San Francisco side, and it was I know in our articles, we often talked about the San Francisco supervisors and their grievances, but it really was coming from what I was hearing, it was coming from Santa Clara as well. They just were kind of smartly above the fray until they weren't. But it was definitely, it at many points felt like it was two counties against, it was like a group of leaders in Santa Clara and a group of leaders in San Francisco who wanted vying for more power from San Mateo. But the two supervisors in San Francisco, Supervisor Walton, who is on the Caltrain board, and Supervisor Peskin, have asked for this stuff before. I mean, they also sort of tried to derail the faster Bay Area measure, which got derailed on its own because of the same things. They wanted more control over decision making at Caltrain. So this isn't like the first time they have tried to, I guess you could say, use their leverage in as far as approving and getting a regional measure on the ballot to get something like small that they wanted, just like more power within an agency.
Yep. And that's a big problem when it's riders that wind up losing. So, I mean, that's something that, we collectively as people that are transit riders and transit supporters, need to be vocal. And I think something that the press has been really helpful in surfacing, that like if we turn it into a power struggle between leaders, then everybody loses. And if we keep our eye on the ball of having good regional transportation infrastructure that's accessible to everybody, then we all win.
Speaking of winning and trying to get outcomes that favor our riders, there's a question here in the Q&A. Has the board considered having a task force of marginalized riders?
Yeah, so this is a point where if somebody is interested in attending the Caltrain board meeting tomorrow, they are going over the equity policy, which is very, very good. But one piece that they are not clear about is how to have representation. So they have some really good provisions that require more community outreach about the specific types of station access and service and so on in order to do. But should this be a separate advisory body? Should it be a part of the Citizens Advisory Council? Making sure that there is something that really provides that accountability is a really good point to make to the board tomorrow morning if somebody is able to make that.
Great, awesome. There's several more questions that we're going to work through. I see that two people have their hands up. Just in the interest of time, it might be faster if you could type the question in the Q&A or the chat. Thank you. Okay, so there's several questions about Samtrans, and was Caltrain governance like really benefiting Samtrans or the Samtrans customer base, or like were there merits to Samtrans not doing a good job governing and managing Caltrain? Adina, anything you want to elaborate on there?
Yeah, so I think, so two things. In terms of doing a good job, the report on Caltrain management and governance had a bunch of charts and tables showing that Caltrain was, the most efficient service of its kind in the United States. And, there's better examples outside the United States, but they were at the top of the class in the US. So there's really not much evidence that it was, financially compromised. And in terms of serving Samtrans riders, actually, ironically, the opposite. It's only been in the last year that there's been thought about, coordinating Caltrain and Samtrans service. They were managed in terms of a service perspective almost entirely separately, with the discussion about getting, better integration only recently. So I don't think that there's very much evidence to support either of those things.
Okay, and I think we're probably have just time for maybe one or two more questions. There's a question here about, and this is kind of interesting. Oh, the chat, the questions keep moving on me. Sorry. There's a question about museums and other points of interest not describing how to get there in terms of transit. And I'm just curious if you think that there's more education that's needed, and like what the region could do to speak about opportunities to get to destinations in terms of transit?
That's a really good question that I don't have an answer to off the top of my head, although my colleagues at Seamless Bay Area might have some, like we should think about this, because it is really frustrating when you try to get to like a museum or a destination and it has information about the parking, but it doesn't have information about the transit. So good point for us as like Seamless to think about.
Great. And I think, unfortunately, we probably won't be able to answer all of these open questions, but I'm wondering, Rachel or any of the other panelists, is there anything that you'd like to ask Adina before we start to wrap up?
Let's see. Yeah, I guess, are you, this could be to Adina, to the other panelists as well, like, how hopeful are you at this point about the future of Caltrain, not only given, the precariousness of, we still have to vote on the sales tax, but also everything that's going on, we're seeing BART get, I'm a BART writer, so I have that BART bias, but like, I'm seeing BART just get like ravaged during this pandemic. We just saw AC Transit get like part of it just get decimated. So how optimistic are you about Caltrain in the next year, 2022?
Yeah, I really want to address that question in the context of BART and AC Transit and SFMCA also, because like one of the challenges in transit advocates is like, just as we have different leaders who turn our transit discussion into agency A versus agency B, and if we do that as advocates, we all lose. So there's going to be really significant opportunities and needs to work together to seek federal funding. There's an opportunity, there's some federal deadlines by the end of September to potentially get funding for transit relief by the end of this month. There's potential opportunities with after the November election to get federal transit funding. There's some opportunities at the state level. There's opportunities it's not just Caltrain, but for other agencies. And there's also opportunities at the regional level. One of the things that the pandemic is doing is forcing a lot of different pieces of our region to work together in an unprecedented fashion. And that is happening at the regional level with transit as well. So while we are really in very perilous times, we're going to need to work together to get funding, not only for Caltrain, but for other parts of the system and for transit as a whole, and also to work on taking this crisis as an opportunity for the region to run its transit in a more integrated fashion, in a way that can set the stage for a restoration that would be better than what we had before the pandemic, not just the same, but better than it was before. So it's a risky time, but it's an important time, and everyone who's here can be part of that story.
Awesome, thank you. So I think let's pivot and talk about next steps. And I apologize, I neglected to introduce myself earlier when I started moderating Q&A. I'm Sarah Bars. I'm a board member of Seamless Bay Area. And I'm here to ask you to take 3 steps after hearing this great conversation about Caltrain and what put it back on track. So to save and improve Caltrain service and to weave Caltrain into an integrated transit network like what Adina spoke to, we need to pass Measure RR in November and also build it into a regional network. And so I'm going to ask your help doing 3 things. And no surprises here, they involve time or money. So the first one is to please sign our new online pledge in support of Measure RR. And we're going to drop that link in the chat right now. Everyone who signs will receive action updates on steps you can take to support this measure between now and November. And we just dropped that link in. So please sign the pledge. Second thing, none of this work would be possible without your financial support. I wouldn't be doing my job as a board member of Seamless Bay Area if I wasn't here to ask you for a couple of your pennies that you might otherwise be spending on Caltrain service, for instance, to support robust transit advocacy across the Bay Area. And so today, any donations that we receive, we're going to split between Seamless Bay Area and Friends of Caltrain in order to keep up the great work that we've already done to date to keep Caltrain on track. So can we drop that link in the chat now? Thank you. And so there's currently about 100 people on this call. If everyone donated just $10, we'd raise about $1,000 to support Caltrain service and better functioning Bay Area transit network over the long term. Every little bit goes a long way. And just today, for those who are in a position to make a larger contribution, if you can make a one-time donation of $100 today, we will send you an exclusive Transit Supply Better Together enamel pin as our gift. And there's a way to choose which pin you like in the donation form. So please give what you can. Every little bit matters. And if you are enticed by one of these fantastic pins, then please give a one-time donation of $100 today. And finally, step number 3, this conversation basically wouldn't have been possible if we didn't have amazing local journalism like what Rachel Swan has done here for the Chronicle. So please become a subscriber and support local journalism. We desperately need it. And you can support, in particular, the Chronicle by going to sfchronicle.com. I know many of you are already donors and supporters of our organizations, and we're deeply grateful. So thank you so much for helping us keep up this good work. And with that, I think I'm going to turn it over to Dave to say a few last words.
Did you want me to jump in first? This is
Yoriko. Sorry, my mistake. Yoriko.
No problem.
That's you.
Yes, this is Yoriko Kishimoto, chair of Friends of Caltrain again. And I just wanted to say on behalf of the Peninsula riders and residents, I do want to thank Adina and Rachel and all our allies for keeping your eyes on this very important topic. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And also for all the people who have signed in today, I wanted to say on behalf of Friends of Caltrain, thank you for listening in today. And we look forward to staying in touch with everyone about Measure RR in the coming weeks. Thank you.
And this is Dave Sorrell with Seamless Bay Area, and I want to thank everyone who's joined our conversation today. We'll be sending a follow-up email after our conversation that includes a video of today's discussion and also direct links in which you can take in the weeks and the months ahead to support Caltrain and Bay Area Transit Service. We look forward to staying in touch. Please support local journalism and support your local transit advocates. Thank you all and have a wonderful evening. Thanks.
Thank you.